Hi guys, welcome back. This is the third lecture in our little 4-lecture courset on scientific writing. In the earlier lectures, we dealt with grammatically what clear and concise style is about, how to help your reader understand what you're trying to say. We thought about motivation, purpose, and audience. And in this lecture, we're going to deal with writing the standard paper, in inverted commas. I'm not going to deal with writing abstracts in this session, as there's special issues there, and I'll do it in the next session. As usual, we're using our recommended ebook, Citable, and I need you to have read Unit 2 of that ebook as your preparation for this lecture. Okay, this is Unit 2, and I won't talk about it anymore. We're running through parts of this today. The verbs, so this is the course description for this little 4 lectures, and in this lecture I'm going to be looking at how to write a standard paper and some of the things that you need to know to make it accessible and readable to your audience. Why do we write papers? You're sharing your work openly, and that's a really important word, to a critical audience, or you're critically evaluating the work of others. So this is all about explaining what it means, what your work means, getting your message across, taking them on your journey, or the journey you want to take them on with this particular piece of work. Papers are pretty much the building block of modern science. They are the place where new knowledge is aired and tested and contested sometimes. But if it stands the test of peer review, which is the gold standard for our science, then it becomes part of what is already known. You have added a building brick in the wall of knowledge. So it goes without saying that what you write must be clear, it must be accurate, it must be concise. It must be written with good open style. You need to emphasize, and we'll talk about this in a lot more detail in a moment, both the motivation for your work and the outcome of it. Your paper must include enough evidence, I'd say just enough evidence, to establish the validity of the outcome that you are claiming comes from the work. It's worth bearing in mind that you're probably going to have 2 sets of main readers. The first is on the journey to getting your paper published, and it will be editors or referees. And again, we'll discuss that a lot more next week. And once it's published, your peers. Either or and to be accepted by referees and hence published, as well as cited by readers, your papers must convince their audience that the research you are presenting is important, valid, relevant to other scientists in the same field. So, validity, motivation, and outcome. If we get these right, then actually we should have less trouble publishing, and other people will understand how important the work is. So if we're going to go in that sort of direction, there's a few things that we can already say about what we're going to write. The important characteristics of your writing is it must inform. You are not writing to impress people, you're writing to inform them. Your writing must be helpful, not cryptic. This is not some puzzle day thing to show who is the brightest or who can put the longest words together. Inform people, be helpful, not cryptic, and your work should be outward looking, not inward. So you're not focused on the hours that you put in. You're focused on the results and the application of those results to wider science or to your area. And of course, the style must be open and not closed. Okay, they're the ground rules, if you like. I think this is a really good quote, such that I have it in my academic office across the top of my whiteboard. Weaknesses overlooked in oral discussion become painfully obvious on the written page. We're going to think about a standard, if there is such a thing, experimental paper where you're reporting results of work you've done. Certainly when we're with our research groups or with colleagues discussing results, it often gets quite easy because in a conversation you say, oh yes, well we know about that, and move on to the next thing. And that's useful, it has its own place in the process. But when you write stuff down, suddenly it takes on a new complexion, and issues which you might skip over in oral discussion become horribly obvious. So remember, writing is difficult because you're asking questions a lot of the time. And when you're writing, not only do you have to ask the questions, you have to answer them as well. So I just commend this quote by Admiral Rickover. It's something that I found useful most of my career. Let's do the easy bit, the thing you already know. What does the structure of a standard experimental paper look like? Abstract, introduction, materials and methods, results and discussion. I've put results and discussion together deliberately. You don't have to put them together, but because you need to present results and then discuss them, it's usually more economic in words to put these two things in the same section. So as you report results, you then discuss them. Conclusion, acknowledgements, references, and probably supporting data. Depends slightly on the journal, and it depends slightly on the type of stuff you are reporting. Now, there's some things that you will not write first. They're not only the difficult parts, but there's good reason for doing certain things last. So things that will not be in your first write, but in your rewrites, your abstract. It's one of the last things you do. So that's one of the reasons I'm not going to talk about it in this lecture. Your conclusions, obviously, again, they happen last after you've done everything else. And finally, some parts of the introduction. I'm going to show you or share with you a way of putting the introduction together which can make parts of this redundant, but nonetheless I suggest that if your journal requires a section of aims and objectives as a standalone section, that standalone section should be last. That's just advice. There's one other thing. This is your journey, the journey you're going to take your reader on, and some obvious things to start with which you already know. Nothing that appears in your conclusions will not first have appeared in your results and discussion. Nothing that appears in your results and discussion will not have first appeared in your introduction, and so on and so forth. It's a journey. You don't jump in Star Trek style transport into the middle of a situation. You're in that situation from the beginning, and that situation develops as a direct response to your writing. Okay, let's start with your introduction. And the introduction is not the easiest part of the paper to write. Probably your methods and materials or that area is the easiest. And so if you want to sort of, be happy with yourself, you can start writing the methods, and at least you'll be writing something. It's not necessarily true that your introduction is the easiest part, because your introduction is difficult. You've got to clarify the motivation for the work. You've got to prepare readers for the structure of the paper, their journey. And also, if we take the hiking analogy one stage further, or the journey analogy one stage further, it's like a rucksack. When you go walking or camping, you take your sleeping bag, cooking gear, whatever else you've got, it all goes in your rucksack. Your introduction is your rucksack for your journey from the rest of the paper. Let's now think about the introduction for the next few slides, and we'll expand on them now. It needs to provide the background and context for your reader, so it brings your reader up to speed. There may be bodies of theory or something that you need to talk about before you get your reader into your results and discussion. And that's where it's like a rucksack. You might have a couple of small sections on some theory that underlies what you're doing. And your aims and objectives, the object of the paper. So we're now going to look at these three things in a slightly different way, in a structural writing way, and you'll see where they come out. What I'm going to suggest to you is you think of your introduction in 4 sections, 4 things it has to achieve. Okay, context. Orient your readers who are less familiar. And establish why your work is important. Why should this journal publish this work? The second part, the need for your work, and I'm going to suggest that it's an opposition between what the scientific community currently has and what it wants. And there are ways to set this up, and we'll talk about them in a moment. Third, it needs to indicate what you have done, what task you've undertaken in an effort to address the need. So if the need is the difference between what the community has and what it wants, what have you done to try to help this need, to address this need, to provide what it is that's missing, the link between the two? Finally, you need to prepare your reader for the journey, because this introduction has the object, the why you're doing the paper, what's the aim of the paper in it. And you need to prepare your audience for the structure you're going to use to realize this object. Okay, so let's break this down into sections and then work on each section. Context, need, and we're going to leverage the need of what we have as opposed to what we want. The task, the thing you've done, and the object of the paper. So I'm going to show you in a real paper what I mean by these headings. Okay, here's a paper, example of some of my own work, on passive samplers and their development of a new passive sampler, actually a new type of passive sampler. And it's by Atmospheric Environment, which in the air quality atmospheric media is a very highly cited journal. Okay, let's go to the introduction and have a look. Okay, remember our 4 headings are context, need, what we have and what we want, task, and object. So, context, it's highlighted here, and this highlighted paper is actually in the Dropbox on IVLE. The context, Why are we doing this work? What is it about? And there's a little bit on the use of passive samplers, and your context ends here, basically. So it explains to the reader what the context of this work is. Now, the next second stage is about need, what we have got. Well, here we are. Although there are different formats and methodologies of preparation which each brings difficulties and intercomparisons, all agree that these tubes oversample in the outdoor environment. That's what we've got. That's the problem, if you like, with these devices. And remember, we're setting up need in difference between what we have got, and what we want. What do we want? Well, it's here. This issue is effectively one of kinetics and could be resolved if the sampling rate of the passive sampler was much higher than the rate of the NO03 reaction. Okay, so we're setting up what we've currently got and what we would want. So the leverage of those two things is what we use to describe the need. The task. So what have we done to try to bridge that gap? And the authors have prepared a flat type porous PE membrane, blah, 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 blah. That's what we did. We found, or we tried out effectively a new idea, and not completely new because some of the author team had done similar things, and well, different things actually, but certainly had used the same membrane and had got experience with it. And finally, the object of the paper. There it is. So your introduction needs to give context, explain the need, talk to your audience about what you've done, and then what the object of the paper is. And this is just one not particularly good example of that happening and being done in the introduction. That way, your introduction serves the purpose that it needs to serve to take your audience with you. I suggest, as has been done in the paper you just looked at, use the context and the need together like a funnel. So you start broad and progressively narrow down to the issue addressed in the paper. And if you look at the paper you've just looked at, it starts by talking about all sorts of passive samplers, types of passive samplers and what they're used for, and gradually then brings it down to what the problem is and what you're going to address. If you can provide a compelling motivation for the work presented in your paper, that will spark the interest of your readers, which is what you want. I read so many papers that it seems to me that what the authors are saying is, this has never been studied before, so that actually is why we're doing this. Yeah, it's a good reason to do it, but it's not of itself necessarily a compelling reason which will excite people. I'm afraid it doesn't tend to excite me. So each of the sections we've spoken about walk through a little journey of its own almost. So this is the way to write the context in such a way that it appeals to a broad range of readers and leads into the need. It's organic. You shouldn't think, oh, stop, now we're going to talk about need. It's a unified commentary. Don't include the context for the sake of context. That just becomes boring. Context is best if it's short rather than biblical in proportions. Your rule should be provide only the information that will help the readers better understand the need and particularly its importance. Consider anchoring the commentary of a narrative either in time or in geography. Phrases like recently, in the past 10 years, or recent work, or since the early 1850s, whatever it is, or geographically, in Singapore, ... or whatever. All of these things engage your audience, which is exactly what you need to do. Okay, the need, what we have versus what we want. We've talked about that already. And the task. It'll usually be you and your colleagues that have done this work, but it's useful to actually put yourself in as the subject of the sentence. So, for instance, we have, or the authors have, and it's first person. It's verbs, it's action, it's subject and action close together. You should set that verb in the past tense because it's something you have done. So coming back to our paper, here's an example. The authors have prepared blah, 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 and proposed blah, blah, blah. So that's the action. And of course, the aim appears below. Okay, so the next stage. Okay, so let's look at some example verbs that you might use in defining the action. Apply, assess, calculate, compare, determine, evaluate, maybe discuss. Whatever works here, these are just examples. These are good verbs for a task. And finally, the object of the paper. Use the document itself as the subject of the sentence. This paper, this letter, this work, and use the verb expressing a communication action and set the verb in the present tense. From the paper that we've been looking at, the aim of this paper is to discuss a potential alternation of the flat diffuser from the viewpoint of diffusion and absorption processes, and to demonstrate the use of a new design sampler for the determination of atmospheric concentration of NO2. Okay, a little bit terse, too terse. I think looking at it now, I'd like a couple more words in there, but actually that's fine. We've shown at the end of the introduction what the object of the paper is. No doubt, it's not clear and wishy-washy. We know exactly what we're doing. And you probably don't need these, but in terms of the object of the paper, some more suggestions or verbs you might use. It's not a definitive list. It's simply suggestions if you're trying to work out how to nutshell the object of your paper. Okay. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is this idea that you're preparing your reader for the journey ahead for the rest of the paper. And I'm going to do this using a paper by a couple of good colleagues of mine. The complete paper is actually in the Dropbox, and it's by Andrew Watson and Jim Lovelock. And it's a very famous paper about the Gaia hypothesis, and it was where they began to try to find a modelling basis, and they invented a world called Daisy World. And let's look at that a bit more now. So the aim here is to signpost where you're going to be going. Now, if your style allows it, one signposting method, which is very effective, is to have an inclusive overarching paragraph before the sections. But very often it's okay, it's easy to do that in a thesis. It's actually quite hard to do that in a paper. Anyway, let's have a quick look at this paper. And here it is. I must confess, when I read this paper, first of all, many, many years ago, I was actually a little bit jealous because it's such a good paper. And it's been one of the things where a number of papers I've looked at and thought, When I can write like this, I can write. Anyway, so I won't go through the whole paper. I mean, it's got so many lessons in it that we'd be here all day. Okay, so I'd like to draw your attention to two things that these fine writers have done. The first thing they've done is they have deliberately limited the scope, which is specifically designed to display the characteristics in which we are interested. Namely, they've reduced content, so increased focus. Scientists, we're ridiculous, aren't we? We just like to put everything in there as much as we can without realizing that can cloud the objective. Here they've reduced the amount of material, they've increased the focus and reduced the scope to make crystal clear what it is they want. And of course, this provides or goes into the description of what is to come. And very neat piece of work. Here, these writers warn the reader, it's not trying to model the planet Earth, but it displays clearly certain properties that are important to that planetary system. Okay, we've done enough on the introduction. Let's now think about the next section, which is the materials and methods. Now, it could easily be that you don't have any materials. Some work doesn't really have very much in the way of material. I've split the so-called materials and methods section into maybe 4 sections. I think if it's an environmental paper, you might well have stuff about samples and sampling, site information, where and how the samples were taken, how many dates, how they was treated and stored, etc., etc. So I think if your paper is in this area, the first part of your methods, first subheading, will be samples. The second part of your methods section will probably be your analysis, how you analyze, what instruments you used, what reagents, settings, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, if you've not got an environmental paper, you're likely not to have the first section. You might well have the second section, almost certainly, and you'd have a materials section if it's required. And finally, the last part of your methods and materials is your paradigm or your framework for analysis. What is your paradigm for your analysis or the framework for your analysis, the tools that you've used? For me, I'm looking just at the moment on positive matrix factorization. It's a way of looking at source apportionment and correlating components. That's just the work I'm doing. Here, you might have the statistical basis of your analysis. What analytical tools are you going to use to analyze your results? And in the environment, that's pretty much a must. Mind you, a general thing about the methods section entirely, do people want to see it here? Is it something your reader needs to know first? For most papers, it's expected to be here, and I suggest it should be here. But you almost certainly want to aim at keeping this small, even if it means putting some of the other material in an appendix. Things to make this section interesting: explain the choices you made in your procedures or your sampling. What justifies using, I don't know, a given compound or a given type of sample? Is there anything special or unexpected or different in your approach? Put these things in early. Remember the rules, that you're trying to encourage people, their interest. So if there are special things, These go in early, ideally in the first sentence almost of the section of the methods and materials that you're in. What follows now is a few examples, actually not from a published paper, but one that myself and my colleagues are in the process of writing at the moment. But as I was actually doing this last night, it seems a convenient thing maybe to look at. So, sampling site. This is an environmental paper. It's about sampling rainfall basically, and then the analysis of that rainfall. So, very simply, description of where the sampling site was. Is actually, I hope. Sample collection, storage, how things were collected, how they were stored. For many pieces of work, in fact probably for any work, how you treat your samples defines what you can do with the results, so it's important. Chemical analysis. What analyses were done, what instruments they were done on, that sort of information is here. There are asterisks here because it's a draft and I don't yet know whether it's figure 1 or appendix 1 or wherever. But notice here is just a description of the equipment. The detailed programming appears elsewhere in appendix 1. It's a journey. You are not going to lead your reader into a 3-page table of methods or whatever. You've lost. They've forgotten the journey they're on. They're into stuff which is not relevant to their immediate journey. So here's an example of using an appendix to box away some of the details. And in this particular work, we've looked at where the air masses have come from to deliver the precipitation. So this is part of the methods section. It's not the main function of the work. It's not about the rainfall. It's about one of the tools, the paradigms we've used to be able to analyze our results. Okay, we're through the introduction, we're through the methods, we're now into the results and discussion. Now, this is actually important. Somebody very famous said that good science is written down, it's not written up. And we've touched on that before, that you're not writing to impress, you're writing to show your work. Let's start at the obvious things about results and discussion. State your results, show your results, discuss your results. Again, large tables of results are going to break up the journey. They go in the appendix. You will almost certainly have some sort of summary table of your results, or maybe plots of your results, but you do not need a 2-page or 1-page table of all of your numbers in your results section. Don't let your reader guess. They'll get frustrated. It's your journey, you've designed it. So lead up with what you want to say at the beginning of your paragraphs, not at the end. Now, you're going to present and discuss your research results, and conventionally you put your results up and then discuss them. This is one of the major reasons for putting results and discussions together, because readers can seldom make sense of the results alone without some interpretation. You need to tell your reader what your results mean. Throughout the paper, but particularly in this section, use the first line of each of your paragraphs to signpost what that paragraph is about and what you want to remember, what you want them to remember. Focus on the phenomenon, not on your observation of it. You went through a whole chronological journey to get your results. You don't need to take your reader through that. I'll give you an example of what I mean. Okay, this is focused on what the author did and the order they did it in. It's not focused on the results and the meaning. And okay, this is not particularly my area, but oh my God, I'm bogged down in things like resistance signals and I've got no idea what this is about. At the end, here, yes, they do conclude what they're about. But this will kill a reader. So, do it the other way. Yes, you had to do the journey. You did it in a certain order. But when you report your results, you can focus on the results. So you start with the point of the paragraph and then go through the stuff which is what actually happened. But you are now focused on the results, not on the experiment you did. Okay, we'll practice this in the class. We're getting there because we got to conclusions. Your conclusions shouldn't just restate what you have concluded in your discussion, because in your results and discussion, your discussions will lead to conclusions. If you're writing a strong paper, an influential paper, then that conclusion will expand and broaden and apply your conclusions to the real world. I'm not going to re-show the Lovelock and Watson paper. You've got it in the work bin. And maybe this is slightly unfair because it's actually about the planet anyway. But oh goodness, what an expansion! What a broadening! Extrapolation from Daisy World to the Earth is, to say the least, tenuous. However, and then it goes on, actually taking us right into what was then the modern climate change debate and the role of life on Earth. Maybe slightly unfair given the subject matter, but aim to broaden your conclusions and apply them to your area so that people again see why this paper is so important and what you've got to say. Finally, acknowledgements, references, supporting data. We're not talking about abstract here, as I've said previously. Always good to acknowledge people that have helped you, and I would always suggest you do this. But something you must do, you must acknowledge your funders. It's usually a condition of your research grant. So, for instance, you will have something like, this study is sponsored by blah, 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 with the grant number. And importantly, the content of this document is not intended to represent the views of whatever organisation that is. Everything you do will be cited, referenced and supported. And for that, I suggest you use EndNote or Mendeley. I personally use Mendeley, but I know on this course you've been introduced to EndNote. A number of problems that this solves is that if you make changes later on, particularly in respect of referees' comments, then this takes a lot of the pain out of it. And finally, you may have supporting data. It depends on the nature of your results, and most journals will support either CSV files, Excel or Access files for such things. Okay, that's the end of what I want to talk about today. We're going to talk about the abstract next time, but I suppose almost as an introduction to the next lecture. The abstract may be the only part of your writing that is read. If your reader happens to be an editor of a journal, it might decide whether the paper's actually published, whether it gets sent out for review. If it's a peer or a colleague who's looking through the literature, it may determine whether that peer does anything more than read the abstract. I'm going to end this by stating what an abstract should conventionally contain, what we did, why we did it, what we found, and what it means. But then expand that in the next lecture, because reporting outcome is really, really important. And that's why I've not put it in here. Okay, I'm not going to put the assignment here. I'm going to do that with you in the class. So I think I'll end here. Okay.